The killing of four journalists in Mexico in just the first 4 weeks of the new year once again drew our attention to the threats journalists face in Mexico. The Committee to Protect Journalists called Mexico the most dangerous country for journalists in the Western Hemisphere and the second deadliest in the world after India. 3 other journalists were confirmed slain in Mexico because of their work in 2021, with 6 other murders under investigation, according to CPJ. 60 Mexican journalists have been murdered for their work since 1992. That doesn't include others who have been wounded or beaten or have received death threats or attacks on the offices of their news organizations. We are privileged to have 3 highly authoritative panelists to discuss the current bloodbath in Mexico. Katherine Corcoran is a former Associated Press journalist and bureau chief who worked in Mexico and Latin America for 9 years. Under her leadership, the AP broke major stories, including extrajudicial killings by the Mexican army and a DEA drug raid that mistakenly targeted civilians in Honduras. She is the author of the upcoming book, In the Mouth of the Wolf, A Murder, a Cover-Up, and the True Cost of Silencing the Press by Bloomsbury Publishing, due out in October. Angela Kocherga has covered the southwest border and Mexico for public media, television stations, and digital news organizations, as well as the Albuquerque Journal. She served as Mexico bureau chief for a group of leading television stations and later opened a border bureau for that same media company. She returned to her roots in public radio in 2019 and is now news director and reporter for KTEP, the NPR affiliate on the campus of the University of Texas at El Paso. She has earned several awards for her work, including the prestigious Maria Moores Cabot Prize from Columbia University for courageous reporting in Latin America in 2019, and the Edward R. Murrow Award for Best Radio Commentary in 2020. Vicente Calderon is a respected journalist from Tijuana, the violence-plagued border city south of San Diego, where 3 of the murders of journalists this year have occurred. He has covered the cartel-related deaths as well as the threats to governance these criminals create. He is the founder, and editor of the online news service, Tijuana Press. Vicente reports about the complex region that defines Mexico and the United States on its most western edge. He covers migration, public safety, the environment, and politics, among other issues, and has been keeping an eye on the border media and local press corps, frequently writing about their problems and progress. Moving along, Vicente, I want to start with you since you're quite literally on the front line of this. For those tuning in who may not really be that familiar with it, what is it about Tijuana that is so violent?
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. The main problem is that we are a border city and we are one of the safest routes for transporting big loads of drugs. So we are in San Diego, who has been seeing an increase on the amount of seizures along the border, especially on the border checkpoints. And this is mainly the cause of most of the violence. We are here over 200, about over 200 homicides just in the municipality of Tijuana in less than 2 months. According to the local authorities, those are about 90% related to drug trafficking on these lower levels. But what it makes this city so violent is this dynamics that comes with being a border city. You cannot love just the nice aspects of being so close to the US. You have to deal with these bad and very sad and terrible consequences that we are dealing. Last year, we have a small decrease in the number of homicides, but still we saw about over 1,900 killings in 1 year. So main problem that we have is the being so close to the U.S. it's a curse and it's a blessing.
Well, I remember the Tijuana cartel when it was being run by the Adriano Felix brothers. They've pretty much been rounded up, either jailed or killed, as I recall. But it looks like the situation has gotten even worse.
I would say that the situation is worse because mainly for two reasons. One, and I will think this is a problem just not in this particular border, you will see it in many of the hot spots, so to speak. One is the presence of a new player, a so-called player, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. This organization that it's a spin-off of the Sinaloa cartel has been becoming more powerful, and it's just like this, like the El Chapo's organization about 10, 15 years ago. If you look into one particular case of drug violence, a city plagued by drug violence, you will see the presence of these new organizations. So it's back to what you mentioned about the Arellano Felix organizations. Well, the main, so to speak, so-called personalities or the main leaders, the members of the family were arrested or killed, but many of the infrastructure that they use is put to service whoever is willing to take this route to transport drugs across the border. So this is, I mean, this is very ironic because if you can pay your fees here, you can make a good negotiation. You can basically set up a good route to send big amounts of drugs across the border. And this is still partly run or maintained by this, what is left of that organizations. We also have the new the new hegemonic power, which is the Sinaloa cartel. So this combination of three very strong drug organizations is what has made Tijuana a more difficult problem. I mean, in 2006, the younger brother of the Felix was arrested. And that year we were counting about about 600 murders per year. And again, we have seen a decrease, but we are averaging in the last 4 years around 2,000 murders every year. So that gives you an idea how things are becoming so difficult. And also, one point that we need to not forget is if you check the amounts of drugs seized in the San Isidro and the Imperial County sectors, and the San Diego and Imperial County sectors, is one, if not the number one, is one of the most active corridors of drugs, especially for methamphetamine, heroin, and now fentanyl.
Well, Angela, you're right across the border from Ciudad Juarez, which I remember just a few years ago was the most dangerous city in the world. What's the situation like that now?
Well, similar to what Vicente said, of course, these are drug smuggling corridors. And so often the violence you're talking about happens when there's some disruption in the power status quo. And we're seeing a kind of a spike in that, or sometimes after new administrations come into office. We have a new mayor, new governor Chihuahua, and Mayor Juarez took office last fall. And the U.S. ambassador was here to talk about signing a pact and helping, cities in Chihuahua reduce violence in other parts of Mexico. And less than a month later, we saw an explosion in violence and some horribly graphic, violent crimes, public displays of violence meant to terrorize and send messages to rivals, to local authorities, and of course, to the public. And, we're talking about journalists being in danger. This kind of violence also serves to, especially when a journalist is murdered, any human life, that's disturbing and horrible. And we see murders across Mexico, but it has a chilling effect when we have a reporter killed or a photojournalist or other type of journalist, because we create this silencing of journalists, the self-censorship, and also the concerns on the part of the public to speak out. And so that creates even more violence because there's disinformation, misinformation. And so often in zones of silence, especially for regional media, and because US media doesn't cover Mexico as much as we used to, we don't know what's going on. And that leads to more fear and more impunity and more violence.
Katherine, you recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. Angela brings up something that I've been complaining about, is the American media haven't really paid as much attention to this. They have, with the 4 deaths, recent deaths, we've been seeing more, but why is there this lack of concern in the states over the violence in Mexico?
Well, I think on the one hand, people have become kind of immune to it, or they think, well, yeah, Mexico's a violent place. They sort of like in one ear and out the other. But I think that we need to be more intentional about why the killing of journalists is important, the impact it's having there, and why we in the United States should care about it. First of all, I think the most important point that sometimes we fail to stress is that when a journalist is killed or silenced, that person is not the ultimate target. The ultimate target is you. It is the society, because the people who want to control information want to control the society. And so the journalist is just the starting point. And the reason I think that we can see in an extreme case what's going on in Mexico with the impunity and the attacks on journalists and the self-censorship, as Angela mentioned, and how that creates more confusion and more danger in a society. The reason we need to care about it here is because, and again, I don't want to say it's anywhere near the level in Mexico, but it's starting to happen here. And the people with the same motives there have the same motives here, which is to control the society. And I just want to give out a couple examples. The Committee to Protect Journalists, which has been working to protect journalists and collecting data around the world, for the first time started tracking attacks on journalists in 2017. So just in the last almost 5 years. And in that time, they've recorded more than 1,500 incidents against journalists, and that would include like arrest, harassment, physical attacks, blocking access, things like that. But if you look at just physical attacks, it's almost 900. So more than half of those attacks in the last 5 years have been actual physical attacks on journalists. And the thing is, it's kind of like a slippery slope or a creep, is if we start letting it happen here, we don't understand the ultimate consequence, and we think, oh, that's nothing. We can see in Mexico where that path ultimately leads. And I think that we need to pay attention, and we need to care about that as a free society. And I think as journalists, we need to care, we need to have more solidarity with our colleagues around the world, but especially in Mexico and also in Canada. There have been some problems too, but I mean, like, especially in Mexico, it being such a dangerous area, that we need to work in solidarity to present why it is important for society to protect and maintain an independent press. What does that mean for the average person, not just the journalist?
Vicente, what does Mexico have roughly equivalent to our Society of Professional Journalists as a national journalist organization?
There's new organizations being formed lately, I will say in the last 20 years probably, but I don't think are as strong as the organizations in the US. And one of the main things that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to understand and compare these two cases, two scenarios, is that the dynamics are very different. We don't have as a strong institution as you guys have there or in other countries. For example, one of the main problems is that it's very difficult to organize the reporters, because unfortunately, with a long history of the government trying to control and punishing and pressuring the press, in many cases, we have what we call the sugar daddy press. What it would mean for that is that somebody is supporting that particular media outlet or some particular group of reporters or that particular reporter. So I'm very careful to who am I going to be joining in any case in terms of reporters. Is he completely independent? Is he independent but having the backing of this institution or the military of these groups among the a police agency from the private sector? And it's difficult to talk about that because in many cases you can understand that, I mean, there's some, due to the reality that we live in, you don't justify it, but you can explain the role of that type of relationship that in other countries will be completely unethical or incestuous, so to speak, and it's very dangerous. And the Mexican press had a history of being too close to the power, and power mainly the government, but other the little cacique or the strongman in any community, and not exactly on the side of the people. There's great examples and very noble and extraordinary cases of good journalists in Mexico. Don't get me wrong, but the pressure from the authority and from the powers being makes it very difficult. It's very difficult to survive being an independent journalist in Mexico, and it's way easier and more lucrative to become linked to somebody or trying to pretend to be a good independent journalist, but with some backing from different entities. Again, please don't get me wrong, because there's great examples of journalism in Mexico, but and we've seen some new organizations making good progress, but we still have this problem with the relationship between power and journalism in Mexico.
Well, Katherine brought up impunity, and we've heard about this for decades now. Is from what we have read recently, it would appear that President Lopez Obrador is even more cavalier toward prosecuting the murderers of journalists than some of his predecessors were, and they were not anything to brag about either. Is it getting worse?
I think you're talking to Katherine?
Oh, I didn't know who that was directed at.
Well, Vicente.
Oh, okay.
But I'd like to hear what all of you say.
Right. I was like, after you, Vicente, I'd like to weigh in on that.
Well, really quick. I think that what is changing is that we have this increasing level of violence in general. Yeah, there's a great number, a very sad number and terrible number of reporters killed every year. We here at Tijuana Press, since 2016-17, we've been remembering the Day of the Dead. We put up an altar for the reporters killed in that particular year, and the average is about 12 per year. Not all of them are being killed due to his work, but in many cases we don't know because there's not enough investigation and the authorities are not complying with their responsibilities. So there's this aura about was he killed because of his job? Was he killed because he was close to somebody? Was he killed because he was just doing something that was not completely legal or legitimate? He was too close to a group. For example, you mentioned that in Tijuana we have 3 reporters killed this year. The press corps locally and even the authorities consider that only 2 of those 3 murders are really reporters, acting or working reporters. The other young gentleman who was killed more recently, even his relatives at the beginning told us that he was not an active reporter. I mean, he for a while was publishing in social media and a digital platform, but he hasn't been doing that much. And unfortunately, and this is very sad, and many of my colleagues don't like it, but if the authorities are telling us that there's some suspicions about the activities of that gentleman. When he was killed, a narco sign, as we call it, a message was left after he was killed, and linking him to drug sales at the street level. I've been asking around, and unfortunately, that has to be. It looks like that's some foundation for that. That's some data about it. And the authorities. One of the reasons that you can believe that, or you can put attention to, is that when the Attorney General's office was asked about it, he said that we don't want to re-victimize that particular case. But he was very different in his approach with our other two colleagues. I mean, that's a tragedy. He shouldn't be killed, and the people who killed him should be arrested and punished according to law. But it's a very different scenario, and this is one of the main problems that we are facing when you're dealing with reporters and violence in Mexico, because the violence is against everybody in Mexico. I mean, they are killing women, mayors, cops, lawyers. I mean, yes, we pay more attention to the reporters, and we should, because of the consequences that you were mentioning, all of you were mentioning. But I don't see the effort of the Lopez Obrador cases are better, because what happened is he was facing somebody who was asking in national television for his help. He told him she was afraid of her life, and then she got killed. And so this case has been very politicized.
And you knew her, I take it.
Yes, we were not close lately. I mean, we worked together about the early 90s. We see each other quite often in gatherings of journalists or covering different stories. And we knew about her case because we covered when she went to Mexico City to denounce his boss, the wrongful termination of her job, who happens to be the strong at that time the strong man, politically speaking, in Baja California, because he was very close to Lopez Obrador, and later he became governor of Baja California. So that's why this case has had better results more quickly than the case of Margarito Martinez, the photojournalist who was killed 6 days before the attack on Lourdes' life.
So I'd like to just piggyback on that a little bit, on what Vicente is saying about the complexities of the press because of the history of reporters being closely aligned with the government, and you don't know who they're representing really. So there's a lot of distrust within the profession among journalists. But I just want to say that compared to when I first came to Mexico 14 years ago, there have been people like Vicente and others who have been practicing independent journalism for decades. But just in general terms, when I first came to Mexico 14 years ago, the quality of good journalism that's happening in Mexico now is dramatically increased from 14 years ago when I first came. There wasn't any kind of serious investigative reporting. There's investigative reporting now of the highest level and the highest quality. We have local where the most danger actually exists. You have local media entities looking into local governments and local corruption, and that is probably the most dangerous thing that you can do there. But because of the history of the press in Mexico, it makes it very easy for the governments to say when any journalist is killed, oh, they were corrupt. Oh, they were involved in something. They were doing something they shouldn't be doing. And actually, nowadays, that's less and less true. Nowadays, more cases are journalists, de verdad, independent journalists who are investigating corruption, and they get knocked off by the people who they're writing about. And so, unfortunately, the situation that Vicente describes gives the government an easy out to say, oh, they're all bad. And we don't need to look into this because they brought on their own fate. So it is very complicated. And again, it's kind of a message that needs to get out, because when I started writing my book about the journalist killings in Mexico, I had colleagues, not just in Mexico or here, but in Latin America, telling me, oh, but they're not journalists. The people who are dying are not journalists. And so it's a message that's been very pervasive and is very dangerous and is very effective. And the government uses it at every turn.
I just weigh in, and as Vicente was saying, a couple things. You know, the situation was so complicated in Juarez that the local press club, they're splintered into two and formed a new one because they didn't trust their colleagues during the height of the drug violence. And there were concerns about spies in newsrooms reporting back to either corrupt officials or also to, drug cartels. The other big issue is that Mexican media has been very heavily dependent on government advertising. So the government has used that to manipulate and threaten and force people to cover or not cover certain things. And lastly, we talked about the sugar daddy phenomenon. We're seeing that in the US. We're now seeing people call journalists who are, bloggers working, and you can tell for specific political motives. And so that has been effectively copycatted from other countries, and is now happening now, especially during election season. As far as AMLO, Mexico's president, he uses a portion of his press conference every day to call out journalists he calls liars and to question them as people who are working on behalf of his political enemies. He talks about fake news. And he uses a similar strategy as our previous president to create doubt and so, not only undervalue journalists, but also erode trust overall, not just against the journalists who he says are usually it's someone who's critical of him that he calls out, and has a very effective social media arm that goes after journalists online if they don't toe his official line. So of course, creating danger. Enemies of the people mean they're enemies, we can go after them, whether they're political enemies or, as in the case of the US, literally called enemies of the people. So very, very dangerous situations.
Now, Angela, these cartels don't just operate in Mexico, right? They operate inside the United States. Right? Is it a matter of time before we start seeing American journalists shot up too?
Well, I used to answer that question saying that, it's not because we're more law abiding on the US side or anything. It's because of rule of law, where people are prosecuted and taken to court, and, there are consequences. You have a good chance of that happening. So no, I don't think yet that's going to happen. It's not because, again, we're special on our side of the border. Organized crime operates on both sides, and so it's really just because of the rule of law that keeps. If a journalist is murdered here, there will be or someone else. There should not always. Our justice system isn't perfect, but there's likely to be consequences. And so you talk about organized crime. I mean, maybe we haven't gotten to that portion yet, but organized journalism might be a good way to combat that, where we unite and we band together to support each other, whether it's covering stories or providing resources or collaborating or even holding, our different governments accountable when something happens to journalists. So, but no, I don't think on the US side we're going to see that type of violence yet. Not that it doesn't happen, but really not on the scale we see in Mexico. We can never say we face even a sliver of the kind of danger that our colleagues in Mexico face.
Have you ever received a death threat, Angela?
I've got threats in Mexico. I was always more concerned about people in little tiny towns or the 14-year-old with a gun who was confused. When we had a rash of hitmen who were 14 years old, I thought they'd just get confused. I never thought we were going to have like a big cartel person ordering a killing of a U.S. journalist, because they know that that's not a good business decision. But there are mistakes all the time. In tiny towns, a police officer doesn't think you should be in his town. So I think, but again, I don't think any of the risks we take, they pale in comparison.
I agree with Angela, but I just wanted to elaborate on a couple of things, because we always talk about the cartels. The real danger, when you talk to Mexican journalists, and you, Vicente, you can help me with this, journalists fear the government more than the cartels, because in many cases, it's officials, it's the government who are behind these attacks, and often narco governments, but the governments are behind the attacks. So if you look at the attacks happening in the United States, and Angela's right, it's not by cartels, it's not by organized crime. They are political attacks. And you can, just as in many cases they are in Mexico, and if you look at the January 6th insurrection and what happened to journalists covering that, you saw physical attacks. You saw people coming up and breaking equipment and stealing equipment. And I've been a journalist a long time, and most of my career, I never saw anything like that in my own country. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just cartels or cartel. It's anyone with a political or a business interest that they do not want you interfering with. And that's what we face here. And that's what journalists face in Mexico on a pretty big scale.
Well, I have a couple of incoming questions here. One of them from Rebecca Aguilar, the president of SPJ, which now just got covered up by something. She asked, how do you get your job done in Mexico when there is a divide among Mexican reporters when you have a president that attacks the press? You kind of touched on this. And when you have strong cartels, do you fear for your own lives? And Ronnie Lovler adds to that, why do you continue to work as a journalist? I guess that's addressed to Vicente. What motivates you to stay on a job that can be so deadly? Vicente?
Well, that's a good question. I ask myself sometimes, why am I still doing here? I'm actually a psychologist by training, and I've been tempted to leave this profession because I think it doesn't make sense. But psychology is neither also a money-making profession either. But the problem is, I've been tempted to leave the profession, but I wonder who will left to. I mean, it's not just me. We always find other good reporters navigating among all these problems. And don't get me wrong, Katherine has a very good point. What the accusation of the attacks from the government towards reporters are very common, just to discredit the reporter. That's very common, and it's true. And it's very unfair to the reporters who are basically, in many cases, not me, but risking their lives for some of their stories. But we have I just wanted to say that we need to see the whole picture, because if we don't see these differences, we will not be able to make any changes. We have been seeing a lot of progress in journalism field in the last 30 years, not just from the help from abroad, but also we have a very good transparency laws, the FOIA laws that you guys have. In many ways, the Mexican FOIA law is way better than the one in the States. And this is an accomplishment of the society in general, not just from the media groups. We also were able to see people more willing to denounce people and more willing to believe that things can be changed, because we have a recent history where we saw progress, just even from basic electoral laws, for example. I mean, the first time I voted, was only one candidate, and nobody was willing to participate in the elections. They knew that the election was rigged. 20 years later, we saw changes, and we believe in ourselves again. So more people is willing to help, to find or go for the reporters to tell them who is the government not doing their job. And that is helping us. And I have to admit, I'm in a privileged position, being so close to San Diego, with a long history of organized reporters from the California Chicano News Media Organization, who ended up being the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And they were helping me a lot to be trained, or to see how they were organizing it and becoming better reporters. And we have a big influence, and actually some investment from groups and from USA, for example, who has been invested in improving the journalism capacities from the Mexican media, because we've always seen good reporters from the days of Proceso, from the days of the beginning of Zeta, from the 1980s, this well-known weekly magazine here in Tijuana, who has been the target of at least 3 deadly attacks on his personnel. So we always have good reporters in Mexico, good journalists in Mexico, even from the prehistoric ages, so to speak. But we've seen an increase in progress. But we are going into a very difficult situation with kind of to use the cliche, the perfect storm, because Katherine was right. Many of the attacks come from the government, but sometimes it is very difficult for us to distinguish, to see the difference, who's the government and who's the drug cartel, who's the criminal, and how are they working together. I went too long with this, but I think at least I respond to it.
We have another question, but you pretty much answered this. How do you deal with threats? But here's a new twist. If they threaten your family, is it different than if they threaten you alone?
I think it's equally bad, maybe sometimes worse. The only other thing I'd say to weigh in on what Vicente said, Mexico has wonderful transparency laws. You can really get great information at all levels. But that too is now under threat from the local administration. So that's another concern about this current administration. Yeah.
Well, about the threats, I just want to say that, again, really the most dangerous places are outside of Mexico City, in these small towns where everybody knows each other and everybody grew up together. And the reporters there who are doing real investigations and independent reporting really are, they deserve a lot of attention and support, because they really are taking their lives in not only their lives in their own hands, but their families as well, because everyone knows who their families are. And often that would be worse. And so I think that, in terms of the threats, they'll do whatever works. But a lot of reporters sometimes they try to hide who their family members are to protect them. We always look at it and say, well, when they're under threat, they can just leave, maybe, CPJ or other organizations can help them leave. They don't want to leave. That's where they live. That's where they do their work. They can't pick up and be a reporter somewhere else. They'd have to leave their entire lives and their entire families. And so for those reporters out in the States, particularly the very dangerous states, it's a very complicated situation for them and their families, and their ability to get out of a difficult situation.
Well, on that score, Vicente, what precautions do your people take on a day-to-day basis? For example, I know a lot of newspapers stopped using bylines for their reporters.
Some of the cases of Zeta, one of the most and well-recognized and respected publication locally, it's when they are covering a very sensitive issue, they rather go with Zeta investigations, not with a particular name. But that doesn't really, I'm not quite sure that really helps, because they target everybody. And the case of Zeta, they have been in several cases being guarded by the military. They have to move around with escorts because they know that they are targeted. And again, we are going back to, maybe it's not the top head of the cartel, but one of their minions, one of the low-level lieutenant is willing to just take matters on their own hands, and that make it difficult. And it's very, again, not all the reporters are in danger. You can go out and just, depending on your beat, you can just pretty much do your stuff, no? As long as you get into more in-depth investigations or when you're covering delicate issues, even with the private sector, for example, you're gonna be facing first an offer, a money offer, a bribery to stop writing about that. And they are trying to convince you not to do or to look the other way or change your subject. And then we can see what's going on. I mean, they can threaten you, they can go off, just give you messages that they know where your relatives are or where your family is. And it's very concerning. And I don't blame the reporters that decide not to cover the original subjects that they were trying to unveil or to reveal the problems, because there's no guarantees. In the States, you can go to the authorities and more or less, you have an idea that they will do their job. There's great police officers. There are great investigators in Mexico, but they also are working in very difficult conditions, and you need to learn to find out what who is as much honest as they can there, and you can probably ask for help from them and trust if you trust them. And there's great cops in Mexico too, in this very difficult environment.
Can I just throw out a quick question?
Sure.
What can we do to help Vicente I mean, I talked about journalists banding together, but how can we help? And then I heard you talk about another panel about media workers in general. The conditions have deteriorated on both sides of the border.
Yes, we are. I mean, what you were mentioning before, was right on the mark. Many of the problems that you guys have been seeing with these populist governments, we are facing it here. But again, since we don't have, for example, we don't have enough people investing in the journalism profession, so you can make a living without this temptation, so to speak, from help from any other power. So that make it difficult. We need to take a more in-depth look of the whole scenario for the reporters to be able to try to find a strategy. I've been talking about that we have to move from a free market journalism field to a fair trade journalism field. When you put more attention to the whole environment, the whole process, to how are they producing stories. Many of the people, they call themselves reporters, are just printing or publicizing press bulletins from the government, or press bulletins from different companies. And they are willing to work in favor of the companies or of the government and make things more difficult for the reporters who are more independent. So we need to put more attention. I mean, it's very sad that we have to wait till this particular moment or this dynamic with so many reporters in so fairly in so short amount of time. But I think it's a good opportunity to really gather and explore even the most difficult parts of the situation of the reporters. In the US, it will be fair to just treat your fellow reporters in Mexico the same way you treat your fellow reporters in the US. I just declined about 6 months ago a job offer from a network affiliate. Actually, it's a network-owned television station, because he wanted to pay us way less of what they pay a reporter in San Diego. And I think that's a good way to start. I don't want them to give me more money because I'm in Mexico. Well, just for probably logistics stuff, it will make sense. But I just want to be put to the same filters that any other reporter will be put. But don't pay me less because I'm in Mexico. You can start changing that. Don't call us all fixers because you don't want to call us reporters, because you think the job that we do is way lower than what other reporters do. I mean, I don't have a problem with quote unquote fixers, but I think it, in many cases, is a derogatory term just to pay less. I mean, sometimes the role of a fixer could be done by a taxi driver. Probably, yeah. In some cases, that's all you need. That's good enough. But in many other cases, it's just like, it's not what you write. It's not the amount of words that you put on your story. It's just all the work and the perspective you bring to it. And you have to keep that in mind when you hire a reporter on the Mexican side. Don't give us anything we don't are worth of, or we don't earn, but just treat us more, because that will help us to make a more fair trade relationship among reporters, just like you do in other industries. And that's a good start. And also keep bringing the help and the training. But what is worth to be a better, well-trained reporter if there's no market to be paid for because you're a good reporter? And this is what we are facing here. I mean, I don't work with local media, or I work way more with foreign media or out-of-town media, because the locals are subjected to more pressures and they pay way less. So I'm lucky because I happen to be in Tijuana border. So I work for media just across the border. My colleagues in Veracruz or my colleagues in Oaxaca don't have that chance. The people in Tamaulipas is not just the small towns. I mean, there's big cities in Tamaulipas, in Coahuila, where there's like really desert zones and zones in terms of journalism, because the powers there were very strong, and they don't even publish press bulletins, because that's the level of terror that they are facing, because they've been targeted. I mean, the drug organizations there are way more, how do you say, I don't know, brave or
Powerful.
disrespectful, probably powerful than the other ones. And one last thing. One of the last things that I want to bring, when we pressure the authorities and they give us results, that really has an impact. Why we were not having so many cases of reporters attacked if we have all this problem of drug trafficking from the 70s probably? Because, for example, when they killed Hector Gato Felix in 1988, people was arrested. People was sentenced for that, even when they were linked to the now former mayor and a very strong political figure here. When they had Jesus Blancornelas in 1997, they went after several of the people who was involved, even though we don't have anybody prosecuted in Mexico for the attack on Blancornelas and the killing of his driver and bodyguard. So when you have consequences for the traffickers, that helped us to give us, for a while, even in this scenario, a little bit more, I wouldn't say tranquility, but at least the guys were thinking, maybe if we go after these guys, we're going to be have to face consequences. And also, there's a great collaboration between the local San Diego authorities and, for example, the Mexican army that has been able to intercept communications that has alerted some of my colleagues, especially in SETA, for example. And that's why they were working with bodyguards a couple of times.
I just want to weigh in real quick on the paying Mexican journalists. That's disgraceful. Not only should they be paid the same, but often more because of the extra work they're doing and all the contacts, and then the additional danger. You know, the journalists from the U.S. goes home, and they're still living in these communities. So that has to be, when we talk about shaming Mexican authorities, we should also start shaming some of our media colleagues who try and take advantage.
I
Katherine, you have
totally
anything to
agree.
add?
I totally agree. And I just want to say that, Vicente, I love your point about how U.S. journalists should treat and collaborate with Mexican journalists, because it was very much in the old days, hiring someone, having you do all the work, and then we get the byline and we look like we're the smartest people, when we couldn't really report in Mexico without the help of Mexican journalists. And so I agree that in this modern era, what we need to do is is more collaboration, more, because together as equals, we're going to get better stories. And we can get better cross-border stories. We can get better stories in either country, because you obviously have way better sources in Mexico than an American journalist. And so, but the American journalist might have more resources, or a media might have more resources. And so this kind of equal collaboration is really what I think is going to help us on both sides. And I just couldn't agree with you more, Vicente. And yes, that the way that US media paid Mexican journalists, I'm guessing it's still going on. It is disgraceful.
I think that could be our takeaway from this discussion today, and our challenge going forward. Let's find a way that we can work together.
And some of that is happening. We're doing some of that here along our stretch of border. We started a new collaborative called the Puente News Collaborative that has journalists on both sides. And we team up on, we haven't tackled drug trafficking, but we team up on critical issues like the pandemic, mental health, legalizing marijuana, so binational health. So there are ways to collaborate, and we should just build on them.
The environment too is another big subject where there can be a lot of bilateral collaboration.
We are actually having a collaboration. This will be the second year that we are collaborating with Voice of San Diego, specifically in environmental issues. And that will help us, because we don't have to, it's not just drug trafficking in Mexico. We have so much progress that we're not paying enough attention, because many reports want to their stories, but many of my colleagues are working with several media outlets. I mean, I have a colleague who works as a correspondent for El Financiero. You know how much they pay? They for like 300 pesos for a story. 300 pesos. And this is just to bring
the math,
a
though,
point, and the fact that it's not just Americans not paying well to the Mexicans. Like 30 bucks. Around $30. There's guys now trying to pay $2 per picture. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's $15 a story. Not very much.
It's that, and they ask you a lot. Now they ask you for the video and pictures and everything all together. I mean, it's not just. That's what I'm talking about. Move away from free trade journalism and try to work as a fair trade journalism, because it's not just Americans with Mexicans, but Mexico City with the reporters on many of the cities where they need. And social media and the internet has just made it more difficult, because everybody is stealing the pictures and the information and the video. And it's not like just the video jump on itself to the media. I mean, I'm all for the free flow of information and free if you're not profiting from that. But if you're a company, you should pay for this. Not consumer. I'm not talking about the consumer, but the companies that are charging you with ads to be able to do their story, they should be paying way better to the Mexicans and to whoever. If you go to for a story in Veracruz or in Colima or in Guanajuato, where now it's very difficult to be a reporter, especially a police reporter, and that will help us.
Well, we're down to 4 minutes. And we have a tradition on these IC talks of asking each of you to say why freedom of the press is important. I think everybody is going to say the same thing. So for this particular IC talk, let me just ask you to say very quickly whether you are optimistic for the long-term prospects for freedom of the press in Mexico. And I'll start with Vicente.
I am, because I have no option. Otherwise, I couldn't be here anymore. And I've invested already too many years, and I lost 2 families already because I invested too much time on my personal life to this profession, and it should be working. And I think it's worth it. I mean, when you see the results of good little stories, or when you, for example, we were able to produce with the help of a U.S. organization, a story with proven that even with all the drug trafficking that we have here, nobody has been sentenced in Baja California, at least until 2019, for selling drugs on the street because the way the rules are set up here. So I'm confident that we're going to be able to survive, but we need to keep this conversation going on and moving from conversation to actions.
All righty. Katherine, how about you?
I guess I agree that I can't be anything but optimistic. But I think we need to work harder in this so-called information age to educate the public and differentiate ourselves from in both countries, from all the people who call themselves journalists, because it's confusing people and people are allowing special interests to interpret information for them instead of discerning it for themselves. And so I think we can be optimistic if we work hard and if we increase this collaboration with our colleagues in Mexico, and if we work in both countries to educate people on the importance of the independent press.
Angela? Oops. We're not getting her.
Not only am I optimistic, I was muted. So yes, I am optimistic. I think as journalists, we have to be to get up every day and go out there and tell these stories. But I'm really inspired by seeing the fellow journalists in Mexico and as some have talked about, civil society demanding truth and accountability, whether it's the mothers of some of the murdered victims or, people marching through the streets, really demanding change, and often at great personal cost and risk to themselves. And nothing less is at stake, as we've seen on both sides of the border. When we don't have a free press, we also see dangerous consequences for democracy. So I think we have to communicate why it's important, why journalism is important. Credible, vetted, professional journalists telling these stories on both sides of the border.
You brought up democracy, and I want to throw in a quick personal anecdote. I've covered a lot of elections in Mexico, beginning with the midterm in 1997, but my lasting memory was going into Sonora to cover the governor's race and the midterm election in 2003. And I watched hundreds of Mexicans lined up on a hot soccer field waiting to vote under some shade trees. And I thought, American voters would never stand in 100-degree heat for a half hour or more to be able to cast their vote. And that's why I'm optimistic about the long-term prospects for Mexican democracy. And if you have democracy, I hope you're going to have freedom of the press. Well, folks, we really appreciate your taking the time to give your points of view on this. And I hope that what we're leaving is the need for more collaboration between Norteamericanos and Mexicanos periodistas. And Vicente, I want you to know that there are a lot of us in the United States who care about your colleagues who are being murdered. We're very concerned about it, and we'll do what we can to keep the attention focused on it.
I am very thankful to the US media in general, because I have always seen the solidarity, and I think it's a great moment to put her to work. And I'm thankful with all of you guys for showing the interest and taking the time to address this issue at this particular moment. Thank you again for the invitation.
All right, you're quite welcome, and maybe we'll do it again.
Thank you so much for having this discussion. It's very important.
Yes,
It's been enlightening all the way around. We had 14 people tuned in, and I hope they tell all their friends and neighbors what they learned.
There's a recording. They can look at a recording later too. We'll share that.
That's right. That's right. Okay, I guess that's it. And we thank you, and we'll stay in touch.